The rain was a constant companion, a dull drumbeat against my attic window, mirroring the rhythm of my own hollow existence. Every morning, the same routine: lukewarm coffee, a stale piece of toast, and the meticulous review of blueprints for buildings that would never be built. My hands, once precise and confident, now trembled slightly, tracing lines on vellum that only existed in my head. A year. It had been a year since the fire, since the smoke had swallowed everything, since the screams had died, leaving only the ringing silence in my ears. I lived in a small, rented apartment on the edge of the city, a sterile box devoid of personal touches. No photographs, no mementos. Each empty wall was a testament to what I had lost, and what I no longer deserved to have. The architect who designed their tomb, the thought was a raw, festering wound that never healed. I had built that house, had imagined every beam, every window, every corner where laughter once echoed, and then I had watched it burn, taking with it the only people I had ever truly loved. My wife, my child, my fault. The guilt was a physical thing, a constant pressure on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. It was a suffocating blanket, woven from the ashes of my past. I rarely spoke, rarely left the apartment beyond necessary errands. The world outside felt too vibrant, too alive, a cruel mockery of my internal desolation. The city hummed with a life I no longer belonged to, a symphony of forgotten joys. One Tuesday, a crisp, official-looking envelope arrived. It wasn't a bill nor an advertisement. The paper felt heavy, important. My name, Raj, was typed precisely, an almost formal address. My hands shook as I tore it open, the sound like tearing fabric in the quiet room. Inside, a letter from a solicitor's firm I'd never heard of, tucked away in a remote coastal town. It spoke of an inheritance, an ancestral home I hadn't known existed, left to me by a distant relative I barely remembered. A great aunt, the letter claimed, who had passed away quietly. The old house, it said, was mine, a flicker, not of joy but of something else, curiosity, or perhaps the desperate, irrational hope that a new place, a truly new place, might offer an escape from the pervasive stench of smoke and regret that clung to me. A fresh start. There was no fresh start for me, only different chapters of the same unending sorrow. But the idea, however fleeting, of a physical distance from my current torment was compelling. I closed my eyes, picturing the house from the vague descriptions in the letter, isolated, overlooking the sea, ancient. A place where perhaps the ghosts of my past wouldn't follow. Or maybe, I thought with a morbid twist, they would find a new, grander stage. The journey was long, a blur of gray highways and desolate landscapes. The solicitor, a man with tired eyes and an even tireder suit, met me at a small, windswept station. He spoke in hushed tones, his voice carrying the weight of untold stories. I'll need to sign off on the property transfer, make sure all the old records are properly updated. The municipal building was a squat, imposing structure of gray stone, sitting like a forgotten monument at the edge of the town. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of old paper and dust. Fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow on the peeling paint of the walls. I followed a series of faded arrows, my footsteps echoing on the scuffed linoleum floor, until I reached a door marked simply Warden's Office. The brass plaque was tarnished, the lettering barely legible. I pushed the door open. The room was small, crammed with metal filing cabinets that reached the ceiling. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed cord, swaying almost imperceptibly. A man sat behind a cluttered desk, his face obscured by a stack of ledgers. He grunted, waving a hand vaguely towards a chair. "Raj, isn't it? About the old house?" The solicitor called ahead. His voice was gravelly, his eyes sharp behind thick lenses. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound book towards him, flipping through pages yellowed with age. "Yes," I managed, my voice rough from disuse. He scribbled something, then pushed a form across the desk. "Sign here, here, and here. Standard procedure. Just confirming," I read, taking ownership, accepting the unique circumstances. He paused, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "It's a lot to take on, that house." I signed, my hand surprisingly steady. They weren't like the others. And on one of the drawers, barely visible in the dim light, was a small hand-etched label. "FL restricted, do not open." My breath hitched. The warden cleared his throat, pulling my attention back. "All done. Keys are with I. The house is ready for I." He stood up, a surprisingly tall man, and walked around the desk, stopping near the old wooden cabinets. He placed a hand on the FL drawer, his fingers drumming lightly. Just one more thing, Raj. There are some older records. Not strictly property related, but part of the house's history. Some families have deep roots here. Things that happened, things that were recorded, things that shouldn't exist. His eyes, now closer, held an unsettling intensity. They're not for I. What records? What history? And why did they shouldn't exist? The warden's words echoed in the small space of my car, a phantom chill clinging to the humid air. What records? What history? And why shouldn't they exist? The questions were a burr under my skin, irritating and insistent. I gripped the steering wheel, my grip tight, the fluorescent memory of the warden's office still searing my retinas. He'd seen something in my eyes. I was sure of it, a desperation he hadn't quite named, but had certainly felt. My family was gone. My home was gone. All that remained was this gnawing emptiness, and now this distant, dilapidated legacy. The drive to the ancestral home was a blur of winding coastal roads and ancient gnarled trees. The landscape grew progressively wilder, the air thickening with the scent of salt and damp earth. The sun, a pale coin in the sky, struggled to pierce the overcast canvas. Each mile deepened the sense of isolation, a deliberate severing from the world I knew. This was it, my fresh start, my penance. When the house finally appeared through a thicket of overgrown conifers, it was less a welcoming embrace and more a gaunt, skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky. A three-story Victorian, its gables sharp as broken teeth, its windows like vacant, shadowed eyes. The paint had long since peeled, revealing patches of weathered timber beneath, like old skin flaking away. A sagging porch, once grand, now leaned precariously, supported by columns wrapped in ivy so thick it resembled monstrous green veins. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum. The gate, a rusted iron beast, hung half open, a silent invitation to a forgotten place. I stepped out, the coastal wind immediately whipping around me, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something subtly metallic like old blood. I shook my head, dismissing it as imagination. The house was simply old. The front door, a heavy oak slab, groaned in protest as I pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that penetrated the grimy windows. My breath hitched. This was where my family's story began, generations before me, and perhaps where mine would end. I spent the rest of the day in a haze of unpacking and exploration. Each room I entered seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, a constant, low complaint. I tried to focus on the task at hand, on making this place habitable. But the warden's words kept circling, an irritating fly buzzing at the edge of my consciousness. Files that shouldn't exist. By late afternoon, I knew I couldn't ignore it. My determination, usually a quiet force, now pulsed with an anxious energy. I needed answers not just about the house, but about the legacy I'd inherited. My family's past, my past. I couldn't build a future here if its foundations were built on secrets. I drove back, the journey feeling longer this time, the gathering twilight painting the world in shades of unsettling gray. The warden's office was a squat, utilitarian building, starkly modern against the historical backdrop of the town. The warden, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of bureaucracy, was at his desk, sorting through a stack of papers. He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized me. "Back so soon, Raj." His tone was flat, devoid of real curiosity. "The house," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need more information about its history, any official documents, records of ownership, anything that might shed light on its past inhabitants." I omitted any mention of files that shouldn't exist. I had to be careful. He sighed, pushing a hand through his thinning hair. "All standard records were transferred to you with the deed. Anything else would be archived. A long process, Raj." "I have time," I insisted. "And I'm willing to wait. Or if there's an archive room, perhaps I could review them myself." My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. I knew this was a long shot, but the determination wouldn't let me back down. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. "Official protocol dictates I handle all requests." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "But I suppose a preliminary look wouldn't hurt. The archives are not often disturbed." He gestured vaguely down a narrow corridor I hadn't noticed before beyond his desk. "Fifth door on the left, but don't touch anything without my supervision." My breath hitched. He was giving me an opening. He knew. I nodded, a silent promise I had no intention of keeping. It opened onto a narrow, windowless room, crammed with dusty filing cabinets and precariously stacked cardboard boxes. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and something else, something faintly sweet and cloying, like wilting flowers. My eyes scanned the labels, searching for anything related to my family name or the house's address. Most were generic municipal records, tax documents, property deeds. Then, tucked behind a cabinet that looked like it hadn't moved in decades, I saw it. A plain, gray file box, unmarked by any official label. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, beneath layers of brittle, yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs of people I didn't recognize, was a smaller, leather-bound ledger. No title, no dates. I opened it. The handwriting was florid, almost artistic, but the entries were sparse, unsettling. Dates, names, and then cryptic single words: disappearance, loss. My gaze fell on one particular entry, dated over a century ago, and then, beneath it, a faint, almost invisible watermark. A small, stylized symbol I'd seen somewhere before but couldn't quite place. A serpent eating its own tail, but with an unsettlingly angular, almost jagged design. This wasn't just history, it was a chronicle of despair. I snapped the ledger shut, the sound echoing too loudly in the small room. My hands were shaking, my palms slick with sweat. I quickly replaced the box, pushing it back into its hidden recess, trying to erase my presence. I walked back to the warden's office, my composure a fragile mask. He looked up, his gaze meeting mine, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Pity. I managed a tight smile, just confirming some dates, consumed by the house. And that symbol, where had I seen it? Back in the car, the twilight had deepened into full night. The journey back to the ancestral home felt endless. As I stepped onto the porch, a gust of wind slammed the heavy front door shut behind me with a resounding thud. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, up my legs, and settled in my chest like a lead weight. I could hear the house creaking, groaning, settling, but it sounded different. Not the familiar sounds of an old structure, but something more deliberate, more alive. A faint, cloying scent, like the one in the archive room, drifted past me. It wasn't a word, just a breath, a fleeting presence. I froze, every nerve ending screaming. The hair on my arms stood on end. I spun around, peering into the inky blackness behind me. Nothing. Had I imagined it? Or was the house, my ancestral legacy, already beginning to consume me too? The chill that had settled in my bones after leaving the community center wasn't just the evening air. It was the warden's words, the image of that ledger page, the stark lines of that symbol, a twisted helix, or perhaps a coiled serpent burned into my mind, consumed by the house. The phrase echoed, a low thrum beneath my thoughts as I drove the familiar route back to the ancestral home. Twilight had deepened into full night, the old house a hulking silhouette against the starless sky. I tried to shake it off. Grief, stress, the weight of everything pressing down on me, that's what it was. My mind playing tricks. Old houses made strange noises, but the symbol, back inside. The silence of the house felt heavier, more watchful than before. I found myself checking locks, tugging at window sashes, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine. Ridiculous. I made myself a strong coffee, the bitter warmth a small comfort. As I sat in the vast, echoing kitchen, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached me. It seemed to come from upstairs, from the long, unused hallway that led to the older bedrooms. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips. The house was supposed to be empty. I was alone. I held my breath, straining to hear it again. Nothing. Only the creaks and groans of an ancient structure settling. I told myself it was the wind whistling through a loose pane or perhaps an old rat in the walls. The house was old after all. These things happened. I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee, trying to steady my hands, but then a distinct tap. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, rhythmic, and undeniably originating from the hallway above. Not the wind, not settling. It sounded like something tapping a finger against a window pane or a small stone against glass. My heart began to beat with a frantic, uneven rhythm. No answer. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. My palms grew slick. I could feel the blood pulsing in my ears, a low roar. This wasn't just my imagination. This was something else. Slowly, carefully, I moved towards the staircase. Each step was an effort, my legs heavy, unresponsive. The wooden treads groaned under my weight, amplifying the tension. The tapping had stopped. I walked down the hallway, my gaze sweeping over the closed doors, the the dust motes dancing in the weak light from a distant window. Nothing seemed disturbed. No doors ajar, no windows rattling. But as I passed the third door on the left, the one leading to what had once been the master bedroom, I caught a faint, sweet smell. Not the musty scent of age, but something cloying like wilting lilies left too long in a vase. It was the same smell I'd noticed the day I first arrived. The smell of decay hidden beneath something falsely pleasant. I fumbled for the light switch, flicking it on. The room was empty, undisturbed, or so it seemed. My eyes scanned the space, searching for the source of the tapping, the smell, and then I saw it. On the dusty windowsill, a single, small, gray feather. It looked like a pigeon feather, perhaps, harmless, but it hadn't been there before, and beneath it, faintly scratched into the ancient wood, was the symbol, the twisted helix, the coiled serpent, the same one from the ledger. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the wind. The house was marking itself or being marked. This wasn't grief playing tricks. This wasn't an old house settling. This was deliberate, and it was waiting. I retreated from the room. Pulling the door shut behind me, the feather and the symbol burned into my vision. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The warden's cryptic words, the ledger, the symbol, the house, my family. There had to be answers, and they weren't in this house. Not directly. Driven by a desperate need for clarity, for something concrete to anchor me, I knew what I had to do. I had to go back to the warden's office. He had mentioned old records, files. Maybe there was something there. Something overlooked. Something that could explain this terrifying escalation. It was late, past visiting hours, but I was beyond caring about protocol. I drove back, the night air doing little to cool the frantic heat that pulsed beneath my skin. I knew the layout from my previous visit. The warden's office was on the ground floor, tucked away behind a reception desk. I had to get in. A side door used by staff for deliveries was unlocked. An oversight, perhaps, or sheer luck. I slipped inside, the stale air of the building pressing in on me. I moved through the silent corridors, my footsteps unnervingly loud, echoing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat urging me forward, even as every instinct screamed at me to turn back. I found the warden's office. The door was locked, but the old mechanism wasn't built for security. A credit card, a gentle push, and it clicked open. Inside, the office was neat, orderly. Filing cabinets lined one wall. I started pulling open drawers, scanning labels. Inmate transfers, property records, maintenance logs, nothing. Then behind a large, framed map of the region, I noticed a small, recessed panel in the wall. It was almost perfectly concealed, blending with the old plaster. My fingers traced the outline, found a tiny latch. It sprang open with a soft sigh. Inside was a narrow, dusty cavity, not a safe, but a hidden compartment. And within it, a stack of bound, yellowed documents. These were the files that shouldn't exist. I pulled them out, my hands trembling, no label, just a single embossed symbol on the front. My breath hitched. I flipped it open, the brittle pages crackling, handwritten entries, faded ink, dates stretching back decades, centuries even, names, and then a series of crude, disturbing sketches, figures, distorted, emaciated forms, and beneath each one the word, consumed. It was a depiction of a house, my house, and within its walls, barely visible but undeniably there, were the faint, swirling outlines of a family, my wife, my daughter, my son. Their faces contorted, their forms fading, merging with the very structure of the building, and surrounding them, emanating from the house itself, was the omnipresent symbol. My mind screamed, rejecting what my eyes saw. This was impossible. This was madness, my family, consumed by the house. Suddenly, a faint scraping sound came from just outside the office door. A slow, deliberate drag, like something heavy being pulled across the linoleum floor. I froze, the file clutched in my hands, my eyes wide, fixed on the door. It wasn't a rat. Whatever it was outside, and it was coming for me. What did this file truly reveal, and what did it mean for me, trapped here, with whatever was now listening on the other side of that door, consumed by the house? The phrase echoed, a cold, insistent whisper I couldn't shake. My architect's mind, usually so precise, felt muddled by the irrational. I needed answers, logical answers. The next morning, the need for clarity was a physical ache. I found myself driving back towards the community center, the familiar brick facade now seeming less innocuous, more like a repository of forgotten, unsettling truths. I parked and walked in, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the scent of old paper and dust thick in the air. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, greeted me with a polite smile, I asked for the warden, a tightness in my chest. She nodded, pointing towards the familiar door at the end of a narrow corridor. My knuckles rapped against the warden's door, a sound swallowed by the quiet. No answer. I tried again, a little louder. Still nothing. A flicker of frustration, then determination. He had given me a general invitation to return. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning. The warden's office was empty. His desk was neat, a half-finished crossword puzzle lying beside a steaming mug. He couldn't have gone far. My gaze drifted to the filing cabinet against the far wall, the one he'd hesitated to open yesterday. A stupid, desperate urge pulled me towards it. What if there was more? What if there were files that shouldn't exist? My fingers traced the cold metal handle of the top drawer. It was unlocked. Inside, folders lay stacked, labeled with dates and names I didn't recognize. I worked quickly, my heart thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs, each rustle of paper a potential alarm. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, only that I would recognize it when I saw it. Then, tucked beneath a stack of mundane property tax records, I found it. A thin, unmarked folder, its paper brittle with age. Inside were not tax forms but sketches. Architectural sketches, crudely drawn yet undeniably familiar. They depicted the ancestral home, but with a strange, impossible addition. A subterranean chamber, a vault of some kind, directly beneath the house's oldest section. The lines were rough, but the scale was clear. And in the corner of one sketch, faint but unmistakable, was that coiled serpent symbol, mirroring the one from the ledger. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a house, it was a layered secret. I quickly slipped the sketches into my satchel, my hands trembling. The warden would return. I needed to be gone. I closed the drawer, the click echoing too loudly in the silent office, and hurried out past the still empty reception desk into the biting afternoon air. Back in my car, the engine roared to life, a welcome sound of escape. I clutched the satchel, the thin folder inside feeling heavier than lead. The subterranean chamber. It was a detail I'd never seen in any of the original blueprints I possessed. A hidden space, deliberately omitted. Why? Back at the house, the atmosphere felt different. I spread the sketches on the dining room table, laying them beside my own extensive collection of the house's blueprints. My architectural training kicked in, a familiar comfort in the face of the unknown. I pulled out my scale ruler, my T-square, and began to compare, to measure, to calculate. The discrepancies were glaring. My plans showed a solid foundation, a straightforward basement. These sketches, however, depicted a complex network of supports, an elaborate system designed to bear the weight of something far more substantial than the structure above. And beneath it all, that chamber, its dimensions unsettlingly precise. My eyes scanned the sketches again, seeking any other clue. The symbol appeared on multiple pages, always near the chamber, sometimes almost like a sigil, sometimes integrated into the structural lines themselves. I ran my fingers over the rough paper, a prickle of unease crawling up my arm. The details in the sketches were crude, yet they suggested a sophistication beyond their amateur appearance. It was as if they were drawn by someone who understood complex engineering, but lacked the skill to render it cleanly. Or perhaps, they were meant to be illegible to the untrained eye. The house creaked above me, a long, drawn-out groan that seemed to settle directly over the dining room. I froze, my head snapping up. The sound was too deliberate, too sustained to be mere settling. It felt like a watchful sigh. I pushed the plans aside, grabbing my flashlight and a small hammer. If there was a hidden chamber, there had to be an access point, or at least evidence of its concealment. I started in the basement, the damp, earthy smell filling my nostrils. The walls were thick stone, uneven and ancient. But then, as I reached the far corner, tucked behind an old, rusted boiler, the sound changed. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift. Thud, thud, thud. Then, thunk, I tapped again more forcefully. Thunk, thunk, thunk. It was unmistakable. A different resonance, a deeper, less solid sound. My heart quickened. I ran my hand over the rough stone. But the sound... I shone the light closer, searching for seams, for mortar lines that didn't quite match. Nothing. The stonework was seamless, perfectly integrated. It was a master craftsman's work designed to hide, but the sound was there. My fingers scraped against the mortar, trying to find a weak point, a crack, what lay behind that stone, consumed by the house. The phrase echoed, a cold whisper in the hollow chamber of my skull, refusing to dissipate with the drone of traffic or the distant hum of the city. It wasn't just a turn of phrase, it was a verdict, a chilling premonition that clawed at the edges of my sanity. I drove aimlessly for a while, the steering wheel slick beneath my palms, the air conditioning doing little to dispel the sudden, clammy sweat that pricked my forehead. Every passing car felt like a watchful eye. I knew with a certainty that curdled my stomach that I couldn't just go home. Not yet. Not with that image of the symbol, that twisted serpent, burning behind my eyelids, demanding an answer. He had given me just enough to send me spiraling, and I was desperate for more. The community center, a squat brick building that seemed to shrink under the vast canvas of the night sky, loomed ahead. My breath hitched in my throat. This was madness. What was I hoping to find? Some secret archive, some hidden truth tucked away in a dusty corner. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to forget the symbol, to dismiss the warden's words as the ramblings of a weary woman. The back entrance, a scuffed metal door tucked between overflowing bins, was ajar, just a crack. This wasn't an invitation, it was an oversight, or perhaps a lure. I pushed the door inward, the groan of rusty hinges tearing through the night. The smell of stale coffee, old paper, and something vaguely metallic hung in the air. I fumbled for my phone, its weak beam slicing through the gloom, illuminating a narrow corridor lined with empty coat racks. My feet dragged across worn linoleum, each step an amplified intrusion. I remembered the layout from my earlier legitimate visit. The warden's office was on the second floor, a small room at the end of a long, echoing hallway. What if I was caught? What would I say? The shame of discovery warred with the desperate need for answers and the need one. The warden's office door was locked, of course. But the lock looked old. Flimsy, it clicked with a soft, almost imperceptible sound, yet it echoed like a gunshot in the silent building. I pushed the door open, the room a deeper shade of black. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and aged paper. I swept my phone's beam across the cluttered desk, the overflowing bookshelves, the filing cabinets that lined one wall. These were the files that shouldn't exist. The labels were faded, smudged. Community records, local history, property deeds. My fingers brushed against a drawer marked, in a different, more archaic script, proprietors defunct. My breath caught. This was it. The drawer groaned as I pulled it open. Inside, crammed together, were bundles of yellow documents tied with brittle twine. The paper crackled as I handled it, dry and fragile. Each file represented a former owner, a family name I recognized from the house's deed. I pulled out the first bundle, thick with reports and letters. It dated back nearly a century. The first few files were mundane: tax records, maintenance requests, loss of appetite. Another described a profound melancholia descending upon the head of the household, a local merchant, after the sudden death of his daughter. His wife, the report continued, grew withdrawn, her grief a palpable thing that seemed to consume the very air around her. Within a year, both were gone, disappeared. The house was sold cheap. I moved to the next file. Another family, another tragedy, a young son lost to an accident. The parents, once vibrant, withered. The records spoke of unending sorrow, a crippling guilt that haunted the father, an architect like me who had redesigned a perilous staircase in the house. He blamed himself for his son's fall. The symbol, that twisted helix, that coiled serpent, was crudely drawn in the margin of one of the police reports. Next to a description of the architect's final days, his descent into a quiet madness. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone. The beam danced across the files, illuminating fragments of lives consumed by grief and guilt. A widow haunted by the death of her husband, a farmer who lost his crops to a blight and then his family to famine, a young woman whose lover abandoned her, leaving her with a child she couldn't bear to look at. Each story, each life was a litany of loss, a symphony of suffering. And in nearly every file, sometimes faint, sometimes bold, was that symbol, that serpent. It wasn't just tragedy that befell these people, it was something more, something that fed on it. The house, my house, wasn't just a site of misfortune. It was a predator and its prey: grief, guilt, the very things that had been my constant companions since the fire, my family's deaths, my culpability in the design. It wasn't just haunting me, it was consuming me. It had chosen me, drawn me back, because I was the perfect vessel, overflowing with the very sustenance it craved. My breath hitched. I could feel it, a presence in the room, not just in my mind. It was as if my discovery had stirred something, woken it. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the floorboards, a low thrumming that seemed to resonate from the very walls. My skin crawled. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that throbbed in rhythm with the unnatural hum. It was pleased. It knew I knew. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the suffocating realization, but the images of the files, the symbol, my family's faces, were seared into my mind. I was trapped. I had walked into its jaws, and now I had confirmed its hunger. What would happen when it had finally devoured every last shred of my sorrow, every last particle of my guilt? My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the phone. A widow haunted by the death of her husband, a farmer who lost his crops to a blight and then his family to famine, a young woman whose lover. The list stretched on, page after yellowed page, a ledger of sorrow meticulously compiled in this hidden warden's office. Files that shouldn't exist. Each entry was a story of unbearable loss, a life shattered, a heart broken. And each one, I realized with a sickening lurch in my gut, ended with the subject taking their own life or simply vanishing. This wasn't just a house. It was a maw, a trap, a collector. The air in the small room felt suddenly heavy, thick with the echoes of all that suffering. It clung to my skin, cold and clammy, a silent testament to the anguish documented in these folders. The dust motes dancing in the flashlight beam seemed to swirl with a malevolent purpose, like tiny, unseen eyes watching me. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the profound silence. I wasn't just here to confront my own past. I was a new entry, a fresh victim waiting to be catalogued. No, not me. I wouldn't be another name on this cursed list. I had to get out. Now, before whatever force had devoured these lives decided it was my turn. I jammed the phone into my pocket, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled back from the desk. I scrambled out of the small office, not bothering to close the door. Each floorboard creaked under my hurried steps, a mournful sigh that seemed to follow me. The house was awake, and it knew I was trying to leave. I didn't care about my belongings, about anything I'd brought into this place. I pushed past the heavy velvet curtains in the living room, my fingers fumbling for the latch on the tall bay window. It was old, stiff with disuse, but I'd seen the handyman open it with a grunt a few days ago. Wouldn't budge. I tried again, gritting my teeth, straining until my knuckles ached. The latch was frozen, immovable, as if welded shut. Panic began to prickle at the edges of my resolve. I slammed my palm against the glass, a dull thud that echoed ominously through the room. The pane didn't shatter, didn't even crack. It felt like solid rock. A low groan rumbled through the floorboards beneath my feet, vibrating up through my shoes. It wasn't the settling of an old house. It was deeper, more resonant, like the belly of a sleeping beast stirring. I could feel my teeth beginning to chatter. No time for windows, the front door. It was the only way. The grand staircase loomed before me, a silent sentinel. Each step up felt like I was climbing into the mouth of something vast and ancient. My vision blurred at the edges. My lungs burned. Halfway up, a floorboard directly in front of me shifted with a loud crack. I froze, my foot hovering in the air. The sound reverberated, then faded into a profound, suffocating quiet. I waited, every nerve ending screaming. Nothing. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch me, their painted eyes following my desperate ascent. Was it my imagination, or had their expressions subtly twisted, mouths downturned in silent judgment? I reached the landing, gasping for breath, and stumbled towards the main hall. The front door, a massive oak slab, was directly ahead. Freedom. Just a few more yards. I could almost taste the clean air. I could almost feel the cool breeze on my face. The heavy, ornate iron bolt that usually secured the door from the inside was already slid into place. It was a thick, rusty bar, far too heavy and stiff for me to have missed if it had been open. I distinctly remembered leaving it unsecured when I'd first arrived, relying on the outside lock. I hadn't locked it from the inside. Not ever. I lunged for the bolt, my fingers scrabbling at the cold metal. It was jammed, immovable. I pushed, pulled, yanked with all the strength I had left, but it remained stubbornly in place, refusing to yield. The house pulsed around me, a silent, mocking heartbeat. Then from the depths of the house, a low, guttural moan echoed, not a human sound, but something vast and mournful, like the wind howling through a tomb. It vibrated through the floor, up my legs, into my very bones. Air grew so frigid it burned my nostrils. I turned, my back pressed against the unyielding oak, my flashlight beam shaking uncontrollably. The The long hallway stretched before me, now utterly devoid of light, swallowed by an unnatural, suffocating blackness. I was trapped. There was truly no way out of this place. A widow haunted by the death of her husband, a farmer who lost his crops to a blight, and then his family to famine, a young woman whose lover. My breath hitched. The air in the warden's office, thick with the scent of decaying paper and something metallic, seemed to press in on me. I tightened my grip on the ancient handset, the cold plastic digging into my palm, but the tremor wouldn't stop. Why were these stories here, in this forgotten corner of my ancestral home? I scanned the next file, then the next. Each one a tragedy, a life broken by despair. The pattern was unmistakable: loss, then a consuming, suffocating guilt. But these people were strangers, their names unfamiliar. I needed more. My gaze fell upon a stack of thicker, leather-bound folders tucked beneath a dusty ledger. They looked older, perhaps even more significant. My fingers, numb with a mix of cold and adrenaline, fumbled with the clasp of the top folder. It groaned open, releasing a cloud of fine gray dust that tickled my nostrils. Inside, the paper was brittle, yellowed, inscribed with elegant, looping script. A journal, or perhaps a series of letters. The language was archaic, but I could make out snippets. The burden, the house demands. This wasn't just a collection of unfortunate souls, it felt like a chronicle. But a chronicle of what? Dates spanned centuries, generations, and then a name. Not a full name, but a surname. My surname, Raj. My own name staring back at me from a document penned hundreds of years ago. It was a jolt, a physical blow. The files that shouldn't exist weren't just about general suffering. They were about my suffering, my family's suffering. I pulled out another leather-bound volume. Births, deaths, and besides certain names, strange symbols I didn't recognize. Below them, brief, stark descriptions. Lost his eldest to the plague, then took his own life. Her children vanished in the woods, never found. Guilt for the fire that claimed his kin. The last entry made my stomach clench. A fire. Like mine, my hands flew to my mouth, muffling a gasp. Was this a coincidence or something far more sinister? The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a dizzying nausea. This wasn't just history, it was a mirror. The guilt I carried, the gnawing regret over the fire, the faces of my lost family, it was all here, in these brittle pages, reflected through the lens of generations. I wasn't just reading about sorrow. I was reading about a legacy of it. What had my ancestors done to incur such a curse? My gaze snagged on a diagram, crudely drawn but unsettlingly precise. It depicted the ancestral home, my house, at its center. Radiating outwards were lines connecting to various names, some familiar from the other files, some new. And at the very bottom, almost hidden, a small, intricate drawing of a human figure. My skin prickled with gooseflesh. I felt like I was plunging into ice water. It wasn't just a house, not just a haunting. It was a crucible, a trap. The entity wasn't randomly preying on grief. It was meticulously cultivating it, harvesting it from a specific lineage, my lineage. I was not just a victim stumbling into a haunted house. I was an inheritance, a predestined meal, a chosen sacrifice. A low creak echoed from the hallway outside the warden's office. A sound that wasn't the house settling, but something moving. My head snapped up, my eyes darting towards the door, now a gaping black maw in the fading light. It was coming for me, wasn't it? I had found the truth. But what did the truth demand of me? The light skipped, and I forced my trembling fingers to hold steady. I was in the warden's office, files that shouldn't exist, and every dusty folder I touched felt colder than the last, as if the despair recorded within had leached into the very paper. The air here was stale, thick with the scent of aged paper and something else, something metallic and faint, like old blood or rust. Dust motes danced in the flashlight's beam, a silent, swirling testament to decades, maybe centuries, of undisturbed silence. My eyes burned, the strain of deciphering the faded handwriting and cryptic notations beginning to tell. I wasn't just reading names and dates. I was glimpsing the raw, exposed nerves of humanity, each entry a brief, brutal summary of a life derailed by unbearable loss. I had to understand. There was a pattern, an awful, undeniable rhythm to the suffering, not just the grief itself, but the nature of it. Always profound, always corrosive, always leaving an empty space that nothing could fill. I started pulling out specific files, arranging them on the grimy floor around me like morbid puzzle pieces. The dates spanned generations, some stretching back further than I could have imagined, to eras when my own ancestors would have walked these very lands. Many of the names were unfamiliar, but a very few seemed vaguely familiar, echoes from old family trees I'd glimpsed in forgotten albums. Could these have been tenants, servants, or even more distant relatives? The thought sent a fresh shiver down my spine. Then, a recurring motif began to emerge, not in the text, but in the margins. Faint, almost imperceptible sketches scribbled alongside particularly harrowing accounts. A series of interconnected lines forming an intricate angular symbol. It wasn't a common sigil, nor was it anything I recognized from any architectural textbook. It looked almost like a stylized knot or a trapped bird, its wings unable to unfurl. I found it in 3 separate files, then 4, then a 5th, each time slightly different, but undeniably the same core design. It was crudely drawn in some, meticulously rendered in others, but always there, a silent witness to the recorded agony. My breath hitched. I had seen this before, not in a book, not in a picture. In the house, a faded carving on a lintel above a seldom-used door in the cellar, a faint inlay in the oak flooring of the study, almost worn smooth by time. I dismissed them as decorative flourishes, remnants of an older style, but now they screamed. They were not mere decoration. Someone, an ancestor, a builder, had left these symbols as a silent, desperate language. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, heavy and suffocating. My head throbbed, and the dull ache in my chest intensified. This wasn't just a collection of tragedies. This was a ledger, a record of the entity's feeding grounds, and these symbols. These might be the only clues left behind by someone who had tried to fight it. Someone who knew. I pushed myself up, my legs stiff and protesting. The old files lay scattered, their secrets half revealed, half buried under layers of dust and time. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about understanding the game, learning its rules, finding its weaknesses. The symbols, the architectural details, they were a breadcrumb trail leading not to more despair but to a potential weapon. I couldn't take the files with me, but I could sketch the symbol, commit it to memory. I could remember the names, the dates, the specific details of their grief, hoping to find a pattern, a common thread that would betray the entity's method. My fingers, though still trembling, moved with a new purpose as I pulled out my own small notebook and began to copy the intricate lines. I was an investigator, delving into a history that wanted to stay buried. The warden's office felt like a mausoleum, but now, instead of being overwhelmed, I felt a strange surge of adrenaline. This place, meant to hide secrets, had instead revealed a path forward. I gathered my meager supplies, the small flashlight beam weakening, its light flickering like my own tenuous hope. I had to get back to the house, to examine those carvings, those inlays with new eyes. I had to compare them, understand their variations. But what if these symbols weren't meant to bind or repel? What if they were meant to invite? A widow haunted by the death of her husband, a farmer who lost his crops to a blight, and then his family to famine, a young woman whose lover. The light played across a photograph tucked into the final folder. A young woman, smiling, her arm linked with a man whose face was obscured by a tear in the paper. Underneath, a handwritten note, delicate script, almost faded. He promised me peace. He promised me him. A shiver traced a path down my spine, cold and unwelcome. The file detailed her slow descent into a quiet madness, her neighbors reporting whispered conversations with empty rooms, the scent of lavender and decay clinging to her property, until one day she simply vanished. No body, no trace, just an empty house and a lingering, suffocating sadness. Each one a variation on the same theme, devastating loss, followed by an inexplicable pull towards this house, towards something unseen, unheard, yet undeniably present. The entries weren't official records. They were private journals, police reports dismissed as local eccentricities, letters from concerned relatives who later stopped writing themselves. These were stories of desperate people, broken by sorrow, who had come here seeking what? Comfort, an answer, a return, the blighted crops, the sudden, unexplained illness, the tragic accident that claimed a loved one. They were these merely coincidences? Or was the entity not just feeding on grief, but orchestrating it? Was it a predator that didn't just scavenge, but hunted, shaping the landscape of human suffering to ensure a perpetual feast? The thought curdled in my gut, a bitter taste. If it could cause the initial pain, then my family— No, I couldn't let that thought take root. Not now. A soft click echoed from the doorway. My head snapped up, the phone light still clutched in my trembling hand. It wasn't the hulking, formless presence I'd felt before. It was a woman's voice, raspy as if unused, yet with an unnerving undertone of knowing. She wore clothes that looked several decades out of fashion, a simple dress of faded floral print. I gripped the phone tighter, my thumb hovering over the call button, though I knew calling anyone wouldn't help. "Not here. Who are I?" I demanded, my voice cracking despite my efforts to sound firm. Every muscle in my body tensed. She glided into the room, not walking so much as drifting. Her movement was too smooth, too silent. "Just another lost soul," she murmured, her gaze sweeping over the open files on the desk, then settling on the photograph of the young woman whose lover was torn from the page, or a semblance of it. The entity. It offers what we crave most, Raj. It gives us back what was taken. Not truly, of course, not whole, but enough to soothe the ache, enough to make us forget the true cost. Her voice was soft, almost hypnotic. "It feeds on the longing, you see, the hope, the brief, desperate joy of a reunion, however false. And when the well runs dry, when there's nothing left but the husk of that memory, it takes the rest." My mind raced, connecting the dots. The farmer whose crops died, his family taken. Did the entity offer him a vision of his children, playing in green fields again? The widow, her husband's warmth returned to her empty bed. It wasn't just feeding on the grief of loss, but the grief of the illusion when the temporary solace faded. It was a double harvest. He was so real, Raj, I could hear her laughter. I could feel her small hand in mine. A tear, thick and slow, traced a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to her otherwise placid expression. But the memories, they began to fray. Her face became indistinct, until one day there was nothing left but the echo of her absence, magnified 1,000 times. Her eyes, devoid of true emotion, locked onto mine. And then it took me to what little was left. A wave of nausea washed over me. This woman, this shell was a warning. He was what happened when you made a bargain with the malevolent architect of despair. There was this, the insidious trap my ancestor had fallen into. I took a step back, my spine hitting the metal shelving, sending a faint clang through the room. He shook his head slowly. "Oh, Ire already here. I've brought my grief, my guilt, my longing like an offering. It smells it on I. It has been waiting for your particular vintage of sorrow for a very long time." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something almost predatory in their depths. The house, it chose I just as it chose me, and now I must choose. Will I fight it, or will I embrace the peace it offers? Will I see them again, Raj, even for a little while? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. See them again? My wife, my children? The mere thought was a siren song, a poison laced with the sweetest nectar. But I had seen the files. I had seen her. I knew the cost. This wasn't peace. This was a deeper, more profound form of entrapment. But what could I do against something that fed on the very essence of human despair? Something that could offer such an irresistible, devastating lie, and how many others were like her? Bound to this place, waiting for the next offering, the question had not just hung there, it had wrapped around my throat, a silken noose. See them again? The thought still resonated, a tuning fork struck against the hollow of my chest, vibrating with a melody of impossible longing. I had seen her, I knew the cost. My hands were still shaking, but a cold resolve, brittle as old glass, began to solidify in my bones. I would not pay that price. I would burn this house to its foundations, even if I had to burn with it. The old house groaned around me, a symphony of settling timber and protesting plaster, as if sensing my renewed purpose. It was a living thing, I knew that now, a hungry maw cloaked in brick and ivy. But I had learned its language, its patterns, its hidden grammar from the pages I'd devoured. The cryptic notes, the faint ink stains on brittle parchment, the hurried scrolls in the margins of ledgers, they all pointed to a single, impossible location hidden deep within the structure. The warden's office, files that shouldn't exist. The air grew heavier with each turn, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else, a metallic tang like old blood or perhaps just rust. I remembered a faint, almost imperceptible seam in the library's back wall, behind a towering bookshelf filled with forgotten tomes. It had always felt wrong. Too perfect, too seamlessly aligned for a house so riddled with crooked angles and warped floors. Pushing aside a heavy volume on forgotten heraldry, my fingers found the slight indentation. A pressure point, subtly disguised, I pressed. A soft click echoed, swallowed almost immediately by the house's constant murmur. The section of the bookshelf, silent and unmoving for decades, pivoted inward with a low, grinding sigh, revealing a narrow, unlit passage. The passage was barely wide enough for my shoulders, forcing me to move sideways, my breath catching in my throat. The walls were rough-hewn stone, clammy to the touch, and the floor sloped downwards, uneven and treacherous. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a small, square room. This was it. The warden's office, files that shouldn't exist. It was sparse, almost monastic. A single, heavy wooden desk dominated the center, its surface scarred and stained. Behind it, a high-backed chair, its leather cracked and peeling. Along one wall, shelves crammed with ancient, leather-bound folders and ledgers stretched from floor to ceiling. No windows, no ornament, just the stark evidence of a grim purpose. I approached the desk, my heart a dull drum against my ribs. A single, oil-stained lamp sat in the center, alongside a stack of loose papers. I flicked on my own lamp, its brighter glow illuminating the chaotic order of the room. The papers on the desk were the most recent, dated decades ago. They detailed a series of incidents, euphemisms for disappearances, for lives consumed. But it was the ledgers on the shelves that held the true horror. I pulled one down, its binding groaning. The pages were filled with meticulous, looping script. Names, dates, rituals. My hands trembled as I read. This wasn't a record of victims, it was a record of offerings. My ancestors, the very bloodline that flowed in my veins, had not just lived in this house, they had managed it. They had fed the entity, kept it placated, ensuring its hunger was satisfied not with their own but with others. The warden wasn't a title of protection, but of control, of grim stewardship. Reveal/discovery. My family hadn't been innocent victims, merely living in a haunted house. They had been its keepers, its architects, its providers. They had designed the very mechanism of its sustenance, weaving their legacy into its insatiable hunger. The house fire that claimed my wife and children, it wasn't just a tragic accident or even a random act of malevolence. It was a rebellion. The entity perhaps had grown tired of its diet, or perhaps my branch of the family had failed in its duty unknowingly. The files detailed the protocols for appeasement, for trapping the entity, for the specific architecture required to contain and channel its power. My house, the one I had designed, the one that had burned, was a mirror, a blueprint of this very ancestral home, unknowingly replicating the patterns of its horrific purpose. My guilt, the one I had carried, was not just for the fire, but for the unwitting continuation of a monstrous legacy. This wasn't just about escaping a haunting. This was about severing a generations-old pact. The files also hinted at a way to stop it, a breach, a severance. It spoke of a chamber beneath, a nexus point, the deepest, most corrupted part of the house. Armed with this terrible knowledge, I turned from the desk, my mind reeling. The floor in the warden's office, I noticed now, had a faint, circular pattern etched into its stone. A subtle outline, almost invisible under the layers of grime. I pushed against it, feeling the resistance of centuries. It tasted of ash and despair. A staircase spiraling downwards, its steps barely visible, seemed to descend into the very heart of the earth. No, not the earth, the heart of the house. I took a deep breath, the metallic tang of the air scraping at my throat. My family had been complicit. I had been an unwitting participant. Now I would be the end of it. The stone walls grew rougher, slick with an unseen moisture. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath fogging in the frigid air. The spiral seemed endless, a descent into an inverted tower. They were not words, not intelligible sounds, but a cacophony of grief, of longing, of despair. Then the first image flickered, a child's small hand reaching out from the gloom below. My son's hand, my heart seized. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing it back. Illusions. I repeated the word like a mantra, then a voice sweet and clear, yet laced with an unbearable sadness. Raj, why did I leave us? My wife's voice. I stopped, my foot hovering over the next step. My chest ached with a pain so profound it threatened to buckle my knees. I could almost feel her presence, the ghost of her hand in mine, leading me into the light. But I knew the light was a lie. I gripped the cold stone railing, my grip tight. This was the event, the entity's final attempt to break me. Faces emerged, distorted, screaming silently. My children's faces contorted in agony, their eyes pleading. The stench of charred wood filled my nostrils, the unmistakable scent of my burning home. I could hear the crackle of flames, the screams, my own screams from that night. This was the entity feeding, gorging on my deepest trauma. It wanted me to drown in it, to give myself over. I forced my eyes open, staring through the spectral horror. I pushed one foot forward, then the other, ignoring the phantom hands clawing at my clothes, the phantom voices tearing at my resolve. I had to believe this was the way. This was the only way. The staircase finally ended, opening into a vast cavernous space. The air here was still, thick and suffocating, devoid of any natural sound. The only light came from a faint, sickly green luminescence emanating from the center of the chamber. In the center, a raised dais, carved from a single obsidian-like stone. It was waiting. What truly awaited me in that terrible green glow? The crackle of flames intensified, a roar now consuming everything. The heat was unbearable, searing my skin, and the acrid smoke clawed at my throat, stealing my breath. I could hear them, their terrified cries, the frantic pounding against the nursery door. My own voice raw and broken, screaming their names. This wasn't a memory anymore. It was real, a living, breathing inferno that enveloped me, pressing down, crushing the air from my lungs. This was the entity feeding, gorging on us, but something shifted. A cold, hard kernel of defiance sparked within the inferno. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. My family was gone, yes, but this was a trick, a projection, a malevolent illusion designed to break me, to keep me trapped in the very grief it devoured. My hands instinctively clenched into fists. I wouldn't let it, not again. I wouldn't be a victim, not anymore. I forced my eyes open, though the smoke burned them. The flames wavered, their edges blurring, then receding. The screams faded, replaced by a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the floorboards. The heat lessened, replaced by a frigid chill that bit at my exposed skin. I coughed, tasting ash, but the air was clearing. This house, this ancient, decaying structure, was more than just a building. It was a complex machine, a trap built by generations of my family, and I, an architect, understood machines. I understood structures. My mind, usually prone to spiraling into self-recrimination, clicked into focus, sharp and precise. I'd walked these halls, traced these blueprints, felt the subtle shifts in its foundations. The house wasn't just a place where the entity resided. It was its prison and its feeder. The original architects, my ancestors, hadn't merely built a home. They had constructed an elaborate mechanism of containment, a system designed to both bind and sustain something horrific. The entity fed on grief, yes, but it was anchored to the very bones of the house. If I could understand its anchors, I could sever them, or at the very least, reinforce the cage. My gaze swept the familiar, yet now alien, drawing room. The heavy oak beams, the intricate carvings in the mantelpiece, the very orientation of the windows, they weren't just aesthetic choices. They were functional. Every angle, every material, every concealed space had a purpose. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the walls, a low thrumming that I now recognized as the entity's pulse, emanating from somewhere deep below. I needed to go lower. I needed the truth. I remembered the old plans, the ones tucked away in the forgotten sub-basement, the ones the estate manager had dismissed as architectural oddities. They depicted a section of the house that didn't appear on any modern survey. A sealed-off chamber beneath the oldest part of the foundations, a place referred to in cryptic annotations as the warden's office. It was a name that had always unsettled me, a place where files that shouldn't exist were rumored to be stored. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs, but my steps were firm. I failed them, Raj. I let them burn. I gritted my teeth, pushing past the phantom voices, focusing on the rough stone steps beneath my boots. The entrance to the sub-basement was hidden behind a false wall in the old wine cellar, a section I'd only found by pure chance, noticing a slight inconsistency in the stone pattern. The air down here was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient like old blood. I fumbled with the rusted iron latch, the sound echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The warden's office, files that shouldn't exist, was more of a stone cell, barely lit by a single grimy bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling. A heavy wooden desk, scarred and ink-stained, dominated the small space. This wasn't just a storage room, it was a command center, a place of grim authority. The entity was here, watching, sensing my intent. It didn't want me to find what was hidden. My fingers trembled as I yanked open the top drawer. Inside, neat rows of manila folders, brittle with age, lay waiting. Each one was meticulously labeled with dates and names, my ancestors. I pulled out the oldest one, dated to the early 1800s. The paper crackled as I opened it, revealing a series of detailed sketches, not of the house as it stood, but of its foundational structure, a complex network of lead-line chambers and iron conduits. And then I saw it. A series of architectural schematics, drawn with unsettling precision, detailing a massive, multi-level containment grid built into the very core of the house. It wasn't just a home, it was a monumental cage, designed to channel and suppress a specific malevolent energy. The entity wasn't just in the house, it was part of its original design, a captive force that had been meant to be controlled. The files explain the purpose of the central hearth, not as a fireplace, but as an energy siphon, and the intricate patterns carved into the wooden beams as glyphs. Meant to bind, the house was a battery, and the entity was its charge, feeding on the negative emotions of its inhabitants, growing stronger, slowly corrupting its jailers. But there was more. A final, hidden compartment at the bottom of the last drawer. My fingers scraped against the cold metal, finding a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with a hurried, desperate script. The last entry, dated nearly a century ago, spoke of the grid failing, of the entity growing too powerful, of a desperate, final ritual to rekey the house's containment field. It mentioned a specific, unholy geometry, a structural flaw that had been deliberately introduced into the original design, a weakness that could be exploited to finally break its hold. It was a failsafe, a last resort. The air in the warden's office became impossibly heavy, crushing. I heard a wet, slithering sound from the corner, something massive moving in the pitch black. It was close, it knew what I had found. My heart hammered, a frantic bird trapped in my ribs, but my resolve hardened. I gripped the journal, its ancient leather rough against my palm. The weakness, the flaw, I had to find it. I had to understand the unholy geometry mentioned in the journal. Could I, an architect, truly unmake what my ancestors had built, what had consumed so many? The scream tore from my throat, a ragged, desperate sound that ripped through the cacophony of spectral flames. My lungs burned, not from smoke, but from the sheer, agonizing effort of pushing back against the vision, against the memory. The air shimmered, the searing heat from the nursery door, the frantic pounding, all of it began to waver. I squeezed my eyes shut, a futile gesture, but it was enough. When I opened them again, the inferno was gone. Silence. A thick, oppressive blanket of it, heavier than any smoke. My chest heaved, each breath a painful rasp. My muscles trembled, a deep, bone-weary ache settling into every fiber. I lay there for a long moment, listening to the frantic thrum of my own pulse in my ears, the only sound in the vast, wounded house. I pushed myself up, my limbs protesting with every inch of movement. The room, the grand hall where the entity had cornered me, was a wreck, not with fire damage, not with physical charring, but something far more insidious. The wallpaper, once merely peeling, was now shredded in places, long strips hanging like tattered banners. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight cutting through the grimy windows, illuminating deep gouges in the oak banister, as if something with immense claws had raked across it. The antique rug, already threadbare, was now torn, exposing the rough floorboards beneath. It was as if the very fabric of the house had been stretched and ripped, reflecting the violent psychic struggle that had just unfolded. The entity hadn't burned the house, it had unmade it, twisting its reality. It was the smell of the house, yes, but also of something deeper, older, a rot that permeated everything. I stumbled forward, my legs still unsteady, drawn by an instinct I couldn't ignore. The confrontation had drained me, but it had also clarified something, sharpened a purpose. There was a part of me that knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Not yet. My feet dragged me through the silent corridors, past ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me with a renewed intensity, past closed doors that now felt like gaping mouths. The house groaned around me, a low, mournful sound, as if wounded itself. I kept moving, a phantom weight pressing down on my shoulders, guiding me, compelling me. I found myself on the ground floor, in a wing I rarely frequented, a part of the house that felt particularly forgotten. A heavy oak door, studded with rusted iron, stood before me. I'd always assumed it was a storage closet, or perhaps an old pantry, but a faint, almost imperceptible inscription above the lintel caught my eye, Custodia Veritatis, Keeper of Truth. It turned with a groan of metal, surprisingly unlocked. The room beyond was small, windowless, and choked with dust. It was not a pantry. Floor-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, crammed with leather-bound ledgers, brittle scrolls, and stacks of yellowed papers tied with crumbling twine. A heavy wooden desk dominated the center, its surface scarred and ink-stained, a high-backed chair pushed carelessly aside. This was the warden's office, files that shouldn't exist. My great-grandfather, a stern, unsmiling man in the portraits, had been a local magistrate I vaguely recalled. But this room felt different, more like a vault than a study. A single oil lamp sat on the desk, its wick dry. I fumbled in my pocket for the small, battered flashlight I always carried. Its beam cut through the gloom, illuminating thick layers of dust that had settled undisturbed for decades. My gaze swept across the shelves, past financial records and land deeds, until it landed on a section near the back, partially obscured by a leaning stack of crumbling maps. A set of folders, unlike the others, bound not in leather but in stiff, plain canvas. They stood out, almost deliberately hidden. My breath hitched. The canvas was rough against my skin, the edges sharp. I pulled it free, dislodging a cascade of dust that made me cough. What kind of unfortunates? What kind of case? I fumbled with the brittle ties, my heart racing. Inside, beneath a layer of fine dust, were newspaper clippings, police reports, and what looked like handwritten confessions. Names, dates, locations. But it wasn't the details of the crimes that made my stomach clench. It was the recurring motif, a symbol sketched crudely in the margins of several documents. A twisted, stylized knot, eerily similar to the patterns I'd seen etched into the house's foundation during my initial inspections. A symbol I'd dismissed as mere architectural flourish. Then I saw it, buried beneath a stack of faded photographs of empty houses and desolate landscapes. The document was a legal agreement dated almost a century ago. A pact signed not with a person, but with a custodian of grief, detailing terms of sustenance. And the names of the signatories beneath the archaic legal jargon were my own ancestors. My family hadn't merely inherited this house, they had forged a covenant. The entity wasn't just attracted to grief and guilt. It was fed it, cultivated, perhaps even bound to this lineage. The fire that took my family, was it truly an accident, or was it an offering? The air shimmered, the searing heat from the nursery door, the phantom stench of burning wood and scorched fabric. It clawed at me, the entity, eager to gorge on the fresh deluge of my agony, my guilt. It wanted me to drown in it, to become another fuel source for its endless hunger, but something shifted. This wasn't the first time I'd been here, trapped in this fiery tableau. This wasn't the first time it had tried to break me, to make me complicit in its feast. This time, as the spectral walls buckled and the floorboards groaned under the weight of an invisible inferno, I didn't just feel the familiar terror. I felt a cold, hard defiance bloom in my gut. My family was gone. Yes, my fault, perhaps, but I was still here. And I wouldn't let their memory, their suffering be twisted into nourishment for this thing. No, I choked out, the word barely audible over the roaring phantom flames. My voice was raw, but it was there. No, not anymore. I squeezed my eyes shut, not in surrender, but in a desperate attempt to focus, to pull myself back from the precipice of its illusion. I pictured the solid, cold stone of the ancestral home's foundations, the mortar, the steel. I pictured the blueprints, the lines I had drawn, the structures I had imagined. My craft, my control. The heat intensified, pressing against my skin like a physical force. I could feel the entity's rage, its frustration, as I resisted. It was a palpable pressure, a suffocating weight. My eyes snapped open. The nursery door still glowed with an impassable orange light, but now, through the shimmering heat, I saw it. The thing. The heat bit at my skin, but I forced myself to ignore it. I walked towards the nursery door, towards the core of its power, not to confront it with violence, but with refusal. Every step was an act of will. My legs felt like lead, my lungs screaming for real air. Not this smoke-filled phantom. As I neared the doorway, the entity recoiled, a low, guttural shriek tearing through the air, a sound that was more felt than heard. The spectral flames flickered, momentarily dimming. It didn't understand. It expected fierce submission. It wasn't getting it, not from me. I pushed my hand through the shimmering wall of heat into the nursery and felt nothing but the cool, solid wood of the actual door. The illusion fractured, then shattered. The air cleared. Cool and still. The stench of smoke was gone. Only the faint, metallic tang of old blood, a scent I had grown to recognize, lingered. I stood there, trembling, my body wrung out but alive. The entity was still here, I knew, but it was no longer consuming me. I had cut the cord, or at least stretched it thin. The house felt different now, quieter, not empty but listening. I walked through the silent halls, a strange sense of clarity settling over me. I knew I couldn't stay here, not indefinitely, but I couldn't just walk away either. Not yet, not without understanding. My search led me to a part of the house I'd always avoided. A small, unassuming door tucked away in the deepest corner of the servants' quarters, a place rarely visited even in its prime. It was locked, of course, but the key, I now realized, had always been in my possession, a small, tarnished brass key I'd found among my grandfather's forgotten effects, its intricate head shaped like a stylized serpent. The lock groaned as I turned the key, a sound like an old man sighing. The door swung inward with a faint creak, revealing a short, narrow passage, unlit and smelling of dust and something else, something cloying and ancient. At the end of the passage was another, lighter wooden door, marked with a simple, almost elegant brass plaque, the warden's office. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of aged paper and dried ink. A single, grimy window looked out onto a forgotten patch of overgrown garden, letting in only a sliver of weak gray light. The room was small, dominated by a heavy leather-topped desk and a wall of built-in shelves crammed with bound ledgers and files. This wasn't the office of a prison warden, but of a different kind of keeper, a keeper of secrets. On it, a single, leather-bound journal lay open. Pages were brittle, the handwriting faded but still legible. It was my great-grandfather's hand. He wrote about the design principles of the house, not as an architect, but as a facilitator. He spoke of symbiotic energies, of harvesting sorrow, of creating a living monument to the family's enduring spirit. My gaze drifted to the shelves. Among the dusty ledgers, I found a series of folders, carefully labeled, organized by date. I pulled one out. It was heavy, filled with brittle, yellowed documents. These were the warden's office, files that shouldn't exist. They detailed not just the construction of the house, but the purpose of its unique architecture. Diagrams of conduits for emotional resonance. Records of trials with family members who had experienced profound loss. Sketches of the entity itself, described as a sentient grief pattern, cultivated and amplified through specific, horrific rituals. My family hadn't just built a house. They had built a cage, a trap, and a feeding ground. They were the architects of this particular horror, and they had passed down the blueprints for its perpetuation. The true horror wasn't just the entity, but the legacy. My family, my blood, had not merely tolerated this thing. They had created it, nurtured it, and fed it with generations of suffering, including, unwittingly, my own. My guilt, my grief, had been the ultimate inheritance. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a weapon forged by my ancestors. The entity wasn't just a monster, it was a perverse creation, a twisted mirror of the family's ambition and cruelty. What was I to do with this knowledge, with this house, with this legacy? The entity was weakened, yes, but it still lurked. It still waited. And I, Raj, the last of this line, was now the warden of a different kind of prison. The question wasn't if I could escape, but if I could ever truly dismantle what my family had so painstakingly built.